So I know what you're thinking. What happened to Jurassic Park? Well, to simply put, I do not deal with horror very well. Side effect of having very bad PTSD episodes since a very young age. And well, let's just say I got to about the third chapter and already I had about 5 different things that could potentially haunt me later in life. So yeah, with really no hope in sight for me being able to sleep in the near future, I didn't want to read it anymore. But I at least want to give a bit of a review. What was so shocking about this book? Well, it starts out innocently enough, kind of saying that now that we're entering an era where everything can be biologically engineered to perfection. See it in the grocery stores all the time, see it even in the medical service as well. And the book proposes that it could be used to even bring things back from the dead. One of the few things I know about the movie is Jeff Goldblum's moral of, we thought so much about if we could, we never stopped to think if we should. And that's already present just within the preface of the book. How the book actually begins is on a really stormy night in Costa Rica. It's a medical institute, and it's late. People are kind of cleaning up. When all of a sudden a helicopter from a nearby research facility is attempting to land just outside of the medical facility. The main reason for this is because there is a child that got ran over by a forklift. And then the book goes into nauseating detail about not only his wounds, but the doctor trying to treat the poor child, even saying that he starts throwing up blood and he doesn't have much time at all. And as the kid is dying, the only word he has to say is raptor, which doesn't really mean a whole lot to the head doctor treating him. She is not from the area. But a few of her co-workers see this as a bad omen. My hopes got restored a little bit when we kind of go into a bit of a lighter story. It's this family vacationing on Costa Rica when they go to this abandoned beach. They wanted to get away from it all for a week, and the daughter is obsessed with wildlife and wanted to see some of the more exotic creatures that Costa Rica has to offer. She decides to do a little exploring on her own while the mother and father are there just waiting on the sand. Well, all of a sudden there is a scream and there is just a mangled pile of blood all over her. Thankfully, her fate is a lot better than the boy this book started out with. But you can really tell something is up, as the doctor treating her is giving very vague information as to what happened. The doctor seemed to think that it is some sort of basilisk snake that did all this damage. And the idea that she's having such a bad reaction to it is because of dopamine. Now, I don't claim to be a medical professional, but I know dopamine is a medicine people take to be happy. And my suspicions were correct, because after the family goes home, the doctors are just like, this doesn't make any sense. There's no venomous lizards here. Why in the world did she almost die when she was brought in here? One of the doctors from that lab decides to capture the specimen that the girl was able to talk about. He goes to that same beach, wanders there for hours, before he finds the remains stuck inside of a howler monkey. Which is a little confusing, as I don't think howler monkeys are carnivorous. But all the same, the doctor takes the gibbled remains and then sends it off to an American institute, and they go into nauseating detail as to how they get the scientific analysis of this thing. And it's proven to not be carrying any deadly diseases, so it's thought to be just fine. And yeah, I I couldn't go any further than that. It's even just talking about it now is making me feel kind of. But I at least wanted to do my due diligence and review what I read. So with that out of the way, let's jump into the book I read all the way through to the end, The Great Gatsby. When it comes to classic literature, I feel like they belong in one of two categories. Either they're classic because of what they did back then, or it offers something that hasn't been done today. And I feel like this book is somewhere in the middle. What it does today, that I haven't really seen in a whole lot of other literature, is the way that the book is narrated. It is narrated by Nick Carraway. And we don't even know this guy's name until quite a fair bit into the book itself. Now, what makes this rather unique is that Nick has to be in the room in order for an event to happen. He is an eyewitness, except for one event towards the end, but that's also him recalling a conversation he had later on. So, Nick Carraway, he grew up in the Midwest. He wasn't necessarily born to a well-to-do family, but it was never really a struggle for them to get bread on the table either. He enlisted in the Great War, which would later be known as World War I throughout history. And when he came back, he wanted to get into the bonds business. And there, he decided to move to New York City. He was able to pick a nice, quiet house in the suburbs where he and a co-worker were supposed to split the rent. However, the co-worker had to be sent to Washington on business. Now, it's rather vague. Either this roommate was caught up with some sort of illegal dealings, or maybe he just had a better employment opportunity, but he goes into the house by himself. And he might have a few servants here and there, and he even had a dog at one point, but the dog only lasted for about a week before being ran over by a truck. His house is probably the least lavish in this neighborhood. He is surrounded by 2 gigantic mansions, and he has his little bungalow. While he's there, he's able to catch up with an old college friend of his named Tom Buchanan. He was captain of the football team, and for him, he always saw that as the peak of his life, and everything else after that is just kind of a bit of a downhill. True, he's still got the physique of a linebacker, but he doesn't really have that same thrill that he had when he was playing all those playoffs in college. When Nick goes to visit him, there are 2 women on the sofa. One is his cousin named Daisy, which the way Carraway describes them sounds a little bit, a lot like the American version of Sailor Moon, shall we say. He just describes Daisy with a little too much affection to be comfortable. And the other woman, we find out later, her name is Jordan, and she is a professional athlete. The evening seems to go all right. They have a nice dinner when Tom is called away to the phone, and Daisy is a little ticked off by this, basically saying that he's probably calling his mistress again. Which I think that's rather interesting, given that this book came out and also takes place in the 1920s, and the idea that she's just kind of like, yeah, I know he's running around, what am I supposed to do? They have a conversation as to where Nick is right now. He gives his address, to which Jordan is just like, yeah, well, then you must know Gatsby then. To which Daisy's just like, what, Gatsby? What Gatsby? Nick doesn't really know about this Gatsby, but he does know that his next-door neighbor throws some very lavish parties once a week. After the dinner party, Nick goes home, and he almost talks to Gatsby, but he is lost in thought, and he is just walking the streets. Sometime later, he gets an invitation to one of Gatsby's famous parties. He is one of the few people there that actually has an invitation. Most of the people just kind of say, oh, well, I know a friend, or I have a friend of a friend, or the relative is related. Gatsby doesn't really care so much about invitations. He's got a gigantic house, he has all the preparations for a big party, and so he's perfectly fine with having so many people around. Nick at first is a little off-put by this, as he doesn't know anybody at the party. That is, until Jordan shows up. He's able to strike a conversation with her, and even falls in line with a table with two other people at it. And the whole time, Nick is just kind of like, this Gatsby seems kind of rude. I mean, he invited me to this party, but I haven't seen him the whole time. As if summoned by this call, Jay Gatsby shows up, and he apologizes for his rudeness. Unfortunately, Nick is left alone as Gatsby wants to talk to Jordan by herself. While Jordan is away, the origin of where Gatsby got all his money grows taller and taller down the line. Some people say that he was actually a German spy during the war. Some say that he is a bootlegger. Some say he's dealing with illegal narcotics. There are so many different stories, but none of them have any validity other than the idea that somebody said it. The interesting thing about this Gatsby is that at one point he served in the same division as Nick Carraway did, as he actually recognizes him. They weren't really in the same platoon in any way, but they did meet each other during the campaign in Europe. So when Jordan comes back, all she really says is that she was given the answer as to how Gatsby got all that money. But she has sworn the secrecy, so we are not really given any more details from there. A few days later, and Jay Gatsby pays a formal call to Carraway saying, "Would you be able to do lunch with me?" To which Carraway is just like, yeah, sure. And on the drive down to the city is where Gatsby comes clean. He says that he is an Oxford man. He only really stayed there for about 6 months. He even had a photo to be able to show that this is what the graduating class he would have been part of looks like, as well as his service medal. He's driving pretty quickly down the road when a policeman starts to come up. Gatsby, in response, takes out a small little card and shows it to the officer. And the officer's just like, all right, carry on. Carraway is obviously a little confused by this, saying, "What was that about?" To which Gatsby replies, "I did the police commissioner a favor," and as such he is able to look the other way in terms of speeding. After all, I'm not going that fast anyway. All along the way, just kind of adding more to the enigma of who this Gatsby really is. At lunch, they meet with a very interesting character, which has been rumored to rig the 1919 World Series. Gatsby has to make a phone call real quickly, and so Nick talks to him for a little bit. And the most interesting thing noted there is that he has cufflinks made out of human molars. When Gatsby gets back to the table, Carraway is just kind of like, is he like a dentist or something? But what? No, what would give you that idea? Which is really just kind of a nod and a wink of saying, this guy has killed a man, and he kept a memento from it. Or at least that's the impression I get. I get the feeling it's supposed to be vague, so everybody can interpret it their own way. As they're driving home, Gatsby has a favor to ask of Nick. He knows that he is in contact with Daisy, and Gatsby has been trying his best to get in contact with her for a while now, and says just invite her over for tea, maybe like next week or so, and then I'll just coincidentally come over. Obviously Nick is a little perturbed by this, but he figures might as well go for it anyway. Now, as for Tom and the mistress, it is very much true. Tom does indeed have a mistress. Just outside of the city is an old, beat-up garage. It is right next to the railroad track, which throws up a whole bunch of soot, and everything just kind of has this light color of gray about it. But probably the most interesting thing about this little town, an old advertisement for an oculist. All you just see are a pair of eyes and glasses. And it is very much hinted at that these eyes are the eyes of God in this town. And given sort of that interpretation, I guess you could say they're in purgatory, the idea that God is constantly watching them. Whenever they make a mistake, he'll send them straight to hell, and if they do good, they can rise up above the ash heap. But that is my interpretation of it. His mistress is married to a local mechanic. Her name is Myrtle Wilson, and she always goes under the guise that she is visiting her sister in the city. The husband is a little on the simple side, and plus he's kind of busy with the garage that he just kind of looks the other way with this sort of thing. Tom, Nick, and Myrtle all take a drive to the city. They have a one-room apartment where they always meet. The sister is also invited to help kind of keep up the ruse a fair bit. While they make it there, Myrtle wants to buy a dog off the street. There's a lot of back and forth as to what the purity of this mud is, but she selects what is considered the best one. She buys dog biscuits and a collar for the thing, and it lives in the apartment. This is one of the things I love about this narrative style is when they go into the apartment, Nick, just like at the party, is kind of uncomfortable about the whole situation. He's just kind of sitting there going, well, I guess I just had to wait for my ride. I mean, I can't leave without Tom. He's the one that drove me here, and I'm going to need him to drive me back. And after a little bit, they all decide to have a drink. To which the memory of Nick is obviously getting a little fuzzy. He's had a little too much. And the only thing he can remember is that there was a photographer there with his wife. Somehow he ended up in his bed wearing his underwear. Like I say, I like this narration style. It reminds me a little bit of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. However, the main difference is it's only here that we see that Nick is kind of an unreliable narrator, which makes sense because he was drunk. So, the day of the tea party comes together, and while this Gatsby is considered great, he's considered quite an enigma, he acts just like a 5-year-old when he finally has the chance to be able to confess his love for Daisy. Now, there was a little bit of backstory here I forgot to mention. So, Gatsby, as I already said, was in the Great War as well. He fell in love with Daisy right before he was about to be shipped overseas. And so, he was a little distressed that she got married to somebody else. But he is holding on to that last evening that they had together several years ago, and believes that Daisy is still just as much in love with him as he is with her. It is clearly not going well, and it's up to Nick to try to break the ice a little bit. They're able to start a fair bit of a conversation when Gatsby's just like, hey, would you like to see my place? And they do. Now, what is rather fascinating is the idea that Gatsby had been throwing all these parties in a ways to be able to get Daisy to finally come over to his place. That's why the loud music, that's why the bright lights, that's why all the people that would come over. But in the 5 years that he lived in that place, he was not successful. Even though he could see across the river, and all the time just wondering, why isn't she coming? Which to me, I'm just like, maybe you should have taken the first step and just went over to her place. But as we mentioned before, Gatsby is surprisingly on the shy side when it comes to Daisy. While they are in the dance hall, Gatsby decides to wake up his resident pianist. He plays a few jazz numbers and they were able to dance a fair bit. And then Gatsby decides to give a tour of the rest of his home, including his bedroom. Subtle. And there we kind of get a little bit of a story as to where Gatsby came from. We get a picture of a much younger version of him with an old sea captain on a really fancy yacht. It is presumed that this is his father, but I'm not going to lie, this part was a little complicated, but as far as I can tell, That was more his surrogate father, as he kind of ran away from home and decided to take life up on a random yacht. And there, he would have gotten a fair bit of money. However, the yacht owner was killed by a black widow, you could say. And I don't mean the spider, I mean the idea that she was a woman that saw the man for money and then axed him off and got all of it. We jump to an insanely hot summer. And this was before air conditioning, and even fans are seen as quite a luxury. So all the major players are at Tom's place. You got Tom, you got Daisy, you got Jordan, you got Nick, and you also have Gatsby. All of them are just sitting there, glued to the sofa in sweat, when Daisy's just kind of like, you know what, let's take a drive, let's go to the city. There is a lot of back and forth about this. The heat is obviously leaving him quite debilitated and very on edge in terms of anger. But they eventually agree to this. Gatsby and Daisy are going to go on ahead in Tom's car, while everybody else is going to pile in Gatsby's car. Tom drives past the Ash Village when he comes to the same service station that has his mistress. The assistant that is pumping the gas doesn't really take much of a note of it, but as they are driving away, this Nick Carraway notices that Myrtle is staring at the window with a lot of distaste. Both cars meet up in the city when they go to a hotel room. They both want a shower before they do anything. And there is where Gatsby confesses his love to Daisy, right in front of Tom, because he claims that Daisy never loved Tom in the first place, but has only loved Gatsby. However, this love is non-reciprocal, and Gatsby is holding on to a past that never even happened. Daisy's just kind of like, look, I liked you, but I married Tom. I love Tom. I'm not going to leave him for you. And with that, the party sees the idea of going out into the city as something that was just completely stupid and completely a waste of time. And so they decide to drive back. So this time they decide to switch cars. So you have Gatsby and Daisy driving in Gatsby's car and everybody else piling in Tom's car. Gatsby goes on ahead while Tom is slowly driving behind and kind of worrying about the idea that his relationship with Daisy might be on the rocks. He thought that he was the only one, and now there's actually a little bit of competition, as Gatsby has a lot more money and a lot more influence than Tom does. So, as they near that service station, there is a great commotion, as Myrtle, Tom's mistress, had been brutally run over. Tom is trying his best to console the husband, as well as just give maybe some details of his story to the policeman, as they met this morning, as well as just to clear up a few details, but there's not really a whole lot to speak of there. The whole gang gets back to Tom's house, to which Nick has just simply had enough of the day and just wants to go home. While he is outside waiting for a taxi, he notices that Gatsby is right behind him. From that conversation, Nick is able to surmise that Daisy was the one behind the wheel, and it was Daisy that killed Myrtle. However, Gatsby, trying his best to be a gentleman, is going to take the brunt of it. After all, it was his car, and she was driving so fast that there was no way to be able to identify who the driver was. Nick is just like, you should probably get out of the city then, otherwise they're probably going to give you the chair for this. However, Gatsby does not want to leave Daisy, as he is convinced Tom is going to beat Daisy within an inch of her life. So he waits around the house just to make sure that she is safe. Nick just decides to go on home. He falls asleep for a little bit when he notices that Gatsby returns. Nick goes to him and says, "So, how'd everything go? To which Gatsby's just kind of like, well, she's sound asleep and she wasn't beaten. I guess she should be fine. They share breakfast together, and Nick is trying his best to console Gatsby. However, he can only do so for so long as, well, he's got to go to work. But he promises that he is going to call him at 12 o'clock. It was a pretty slow day as Nick spent most of his day at the office just sleeping when Jordan calls him up at 12 o'clock to basically say, hey, I want to go out on a date sometime. Which Nick is just kind of like, how about maybe next week? I'm going through a lot right now. Jordan's like, okay. After that, he decides to call Gatsby. Now, they didn't have answering machines back then, and he keeps urging the operator to keep calling him. They call about 4 times before the operator yells at Nick Carraway saying this line is meant to be open only from Detroit. Nick is like, okay, that's a little strange. He knocks out a little early and decides to head to Gatsby's place to make sure everything is all right. When he comes there, Gatsby is dead in his pool, and not too far away is the murderer that committed suicide. Now we pick up what actually happened from the garage assistant. So, Myrtle's husband was kind of suspicious to the idea that his wife was being unfaithful. In fact, he was planning on being able to take both of them out into the country where he can keep a better eye on her. And there the assistant pulls out a brand new dog collar. And if you completely missed that opening section, you would think that this was some sort of proto 50 Shades of Grey. But no, the dog collar was just for the mutt that Myrtle picked up in the street earlier in the book. Now, like I said, that advertisement of the spectacles was known as like the eyes of God. And he very much says that's what it is. The idea that his wife was unfaithful, and as such, she is going to be punished. And under those eyes, the person that killed his wife is also going to be punished. So he remembers that when Tom came through before, it was in Gatsby's car. And so he has a revolver in his hand and says, you were the person that killed my wife. Now I'm going to end you. To which Tom's just like, whoa, calm down, man. That wasn't even my car. It was Gatsby's car. And so he went over there and he shot Gatsby. However, feeling the eyes of God upon him, he decided to take his own life as well. And from there, it's really up to Nick to try to organize a funeral for Gatsby. Carraway tries his best to get as many people at the funeral, but the only person that really shows up is Gatsby's actual father. The interesting thing is they didn't necessarily have the best relationship, but Gatsby did end up buying a new home for his dad to live in. And the last time they met was like 5 years ago. The funeral proceeds, and Nick just decides to go back to the Midwest, saying that this whole experience just kind of ruined his taste of the East. And yeah, that's basically where the book ends. In ways, it kind of reminds me a fair bit of Mice and Men. The idea that it is a very short book, but yet it is very powerful. And I am a really big fan of F. Scott Fitzgerald describes the scenes. I can feel the sweltering heat of that hot summer, the nice cool breeze running through Tom's house, the smell of the water, as well as just that feel of grit being in the Ash Village. If there is a moral to this story, I'd say it's the idea that if you live in the past, there is no way you can live in the future. There might be more to it. I mean, after all, I feel like there might be some spiritual symbolism going on with like the eyeglasses advertisement. But that is really the main thing I pick up from it. Especially with the idea of Nick realizing that staying where he is now is only going to remind him of the painful past. The empty mansion that will no longer have any parties. The occasional people that'll show up there thinking that the party is still on when, in reality, the party ended about 2 years ago. And Gatsby was holding on to Daisy, even though Daisy had long since forgotten him. So, yeah, that is The Great Gatsby. This was a rather fascinating book, as I remember reading this a few times back in junior high and high school, but yet I could never really remember what was going on. Same exact thing when I was reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Like, I knew about certain events that happened, but I could never really give the whole thing. But now, well, I just did a review on it, so I think I'll be able to remember this for a little while. So then, I hope you'll join me next time for a bit of an odd book. I only really know it for the title. Stranger in a Strange Land. I'm looking forward to this. Much like Catcher in the Rye, I just only knew it for the title and the idea was a classic, so now it's time to figure out why it's considered a classic. And the fun thing to mention is, as far as I can tell, this is a first edition. However, I don't think it's worth anything without the paper cover around the outside, but not a bad buy for like 50 cents, I would say. Until next time, keep having fun.